Lucas Henderson, or Luke as everyone called him, stared at the small patch of dirt in front of his townhouse on Maple Street like it was a riddle only a mad scientist could solve. Spring had arrived in Burlington with the usual mix of sun, soft breezes, and the occasional drizzle that made sidewalks sparkle and ruin a freshly mowed lawn in equal measure. The town smelled like fresh cut grass, blooming lilacs, and a hint of maple syrup from the cafe down the block. Luke, 32, recently single, and recently self-doubting, had decided that this spring would mark a transformation, both in his garden and in himself. He had purchased a packet of butterfly-attracting wildflowers, a terracotta pot for ambitious planting, and a gardening book that promised, in bold letters, grow your life, one petal at a time. He figured if he could nurture flowers, perhaps he could nurture his own wings, metaphorically speaking. Armed with gloves 3 sizes too big and a trowel that seemed to mock him with every swing, Luke began digging. The soil, damp from an earlier rain, clung to his hands like a jealous cat. He was soon joined by his 6-year-old nephew, Tommy, whose boundless energy made Luke's gardening efforts look like slow-motion slapstick. Tommy picked up worms with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for puppies and ice cream. "Look, Uncle Luke, this one's wiggly," he shouted, launching the worm toward Luke's face. Luke flinched, nearly tipping over into the patch of mud, and earned a peal of laughter from the neighbor's window. Across the street, Martha Greene, retired science teacher and unofficial community mentor, watched the scene unfold from her rose-covered porch. Her wide-brimmed straw hat bobbed as she shook her head, muttering, "Some things take patience, not panic." She ambled over with a wicker basket full of seedlings and a watering can decorated with hand-painted butterflies. "Luke," she called, her voice carrying a mix of warmth and mock severity, "gardening is not a battlefield. Stop wrestling the dirt." Luke, embarrassed but grateful, waved his gloves in the air like a defeated general. As he planted the first wildflower, he realized he had misread the instructions. The roots were supposed to face downward. Instead, he had planted them sideways, a mistake that made the tiny seedlings tilt at odd angles, as if they were performing a synchronized dance of confusion. Tommy clapped enthusiastically, thinking it intentional choreography. Luke sighed, wiping mud from his forehead, and muttered, "Maybe this is symbolic of my life," leaning sideways, hoping someone notices the effort. Martha chuckled, handing him the watering can. The water sprayed in an arc too strong, sending some soil flying onto the sidewalk, narrowly missing a passing jogger named Riley Carter, who was clad in pastel yoga pants and a neon green windbreaker. She raised her eyebrows, dodging a mud clump, and laughed. "Lucas Henderson, you are a hazard to public health," she called. The small community of Maple Street was used to Luke's endearing chaos. Houses lined the street like carefully arranged cupcakes, each painted in muted pastels with flower boxes and American flags fluttering gently. Neighbors sipped iced coffee on porches, waved politely, and sometimes offered unhelpful advice. "Water from the top," one shouted. "No, water from the bottom," another contradicted. Luke, trapped in a vortex of conflicting tips, decided to make a third choice. A controlled sprinkler that rotated wildly and soaked everything, including himself, his nephew, and Martha's hydrangeas. By noon, Luke looked like a creature emerging from a mud cocoon. His t-shirt clung to him, dirt smudged his face, and his gloves were torn at the fingertips. But there was a strange satisfaction in the chaos. He had planted the seeds, crooked, muddy, and sideways, and in doing so, he had confronted his fear of starting over. He realized that growth was messy, unpredictable, and sometimes ridiculous, much like his current state. Later, inspired by Martha's stories of caterpillars transforming into butterflies, Luke decided that he, too, would attempt a symbolic cocoon. He rigged a small terrarium in his backyard with twine, leaves, and a few leftover gardening twigs, dubbing it his personal cocoon corner. Tommy, ever the enthusiast, declared it a fort, and proceeded to crawl inside, claiming it as his secret bug headquarters. Luke laughed, allowing the boy to occupy the space while he reflected on the day. He imagined himself emerging from the cocoon, a better version of himself, much like the butterflies that would one day visit his crookedly planted flowers. As the evening set in, the sky turned a gentle shade of peach and lavender. Neighbors lit string lights on porches, dogs barked in the distance, and a light breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from the bakery around the corner. Luke sat on the steps of his townhouse, mud-caked gloves resting beside him, a feeling of calm creeping over his chaos-ridden day. Despite the slapstick disasters, the sideways flowers, and the sprinklers that refused to cooperate, he felt a spark of pride. He had started something, and sometimes, starting is the hardest part. He looked down at his hands, covered in dirt, and thought, maybe being a caterpillar isn't so bad. At least caterpillars get to become butterflies. He chuckled at his own joke, not yet realizing how literal that metaphor would soon become. The following morning, Burlington awoke to a soft, misty drizzle that glimmered on leaves like tiny diamonds. Luke Henderson stepped out onto his porch, coffee mug in hand, still wearing yesterday's mud-streaked t-shirt from his gardening adventures. The crooked wildflowers he had planted were glistening under the morning dew, some leaning awkwardly like tipsy dancers. He squinted, imagining butterflies fluttering in to validate his efforts. The town had a quiet energy. Joggers passed on the tree-lined sidewalks, neighbors tended to front yard blooms, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from Maple Street's corner bakery. Spring had arrived in full force, and Luke felt, for the first time in weeks, that something inside him was ready to stretch its wings. Tommy bounded over, carrying a small notebook with doodles of caterpillars and butterflies. "Uncle Luke, I drew us some bugs. They'll help you grow." Luke chuckled, ruffling his nephew's messy brown hair, and wondered how much of growth was encouragement and how much was simply having someone else believe you could. Inspired by Martha's words yesterday, he decided to take a step further. Not just planting crooked flowers, but trying his hand at creating a mini butterfly-friendly garden for the community. He packed a wheelbarrow with soil, planters, and twine, ready to transform a neglected patch in the Burlington Community Park into a fluttering haven. Of course, chaos ensued almost immediately. Luke tripped over a garden hose, flinging a bag of soil into a puddle, soaking his shoes and splattering mud onto a nearby yoga class led by none other than Riley Carter. She stood up, arms crossed, mud dripping from her neon green sleeves, smirking. "Lucas Henderson, I swear, you're either inventing a new yoga pose or single-handedly creating a mud festival." Luke grinned sheepishly, apologizing as he tried to scoop soil back into the wheelbarrow, only to spill more. Tommy, delighted, began jumping into the puddles, claiming he was helping aerate the soil. Neighbors gradually gathered around, drawn by the slapstick spectacle. Martha Greene arrived with her watering can, offering sage guidance between chuckles. "Remember, Luke, transformation takes patience. You can't rush the butterfly." Luke nodded, smearing mud on his forehead like war paint, fully aware of the irony. He was attempting to foster life while looking like a swamp creature. The mix of physical comedy, sweat, and dirt created a spectacle that was part performance art, part gardening disaster. By mid-morning, the plot of land had begun to take shape. Crooked planters leaned precariously, soil was everywhere, but the wildflowers were planted, and little shrubs began to form borders. Luke realized that, symbolically, this was his cocoon taking form in the world, chaotic, imperfect, yet alive with possibility. People passing by stopped to admire the absurd, charming scene. Children drew butterflies in chalk on the sidewalk next to the planters, adults smiled at the comedic spectacle, and Riley even offered to guide him on a butterfly-friendly plant arrangement, teasing him mercilessly in the process. The rain stopped by noon, and a soft sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the park. Luke knelt beside a planter, arranging bright marigolds and lavender while Tommy pointed out safe zones for caterpillars. He realized he had inadvertently created a miniature ecosystem, complete with paths for insects, nectar-rich flowers, and sun-drenched leaves. This garden was more than plants. It was a symbol of patience, humility, and persistence. He felt himself changing, mirroring the transformation he hoped to inspire, from awkward caterpillar to confident butterfly. As the afternoon progressed, more neighbors arrived, drawn by the promise of spring and the spectacle of Luke's earnest, muddy labor. Some offered plants, others contributed gardening tools. A few, to Luke's embarrassment, took photos to post on the neighborhood Facebook page with captions like, "Lucas Henderson finally emerges from cocoon." The irony of the literal and symbolic message was not lost on him, and he laughed, realizing that growth was often public, messy, and hilariously imperfect. Martha Greene eventually arrived with her tea thermos and notebook, detailing suggestions for long-term care of the garden. "See, Luke, even the best butterflies start in a cocoon of chaos. You've nurtured this well. Despite everything," she said, her tone warm and encouraging. Luke smiled, looking at the tiny sprouts beginning to sway in the gentle breeze, and felt an unfamiliar surge of pride. He wasn't perfect, he wasn't graceful, and yet something beautiful was taking shape. By evening, the community garden was complete, a testament to collaborative effort, persistence, and Luke's messy determination. String lights hung from nearby trees, wildflowers swayed, and small signs labeled Butterfly Haven and Pollinator Paradise adorned the borders. Even Riley Carter hung a handmade sign reading, Caution, Growth Zone, Enter at your own risk, prompting laughter from everyone present. Luke stood back, mud-caked, tired, and grinning. The sight was chaotic, absurd, and utterly alive, much like the transformation he had undergone. Weeks passed, and the garden flourished. Butterflies arrived in swarms of orange, blue, and yellow, alighting on marigolds and lavender, weaving patterns through the air like living ribbons. Luke spent mornings tending to plants, greeting neighbors, and quietly observing the butterflies. He had learned that growth was not a single, triumphant moment, but an accumulation of small, sometimes ridiculous efforts. The community embraced his humor, his persistence, and his awkward charm, recognizing that transformation often involved looking foolish before soaring. The neighborhood eventually organized a small spring festival to celebrate the new garden. Children ran with nets, laughing, and parents sipped lemonade under string lights. Luke, now wearing a clean but still slightly dirt-stained shirt, gave a short, jokingly awkward speech. I started as a caterpillar, got a little muddy, and, well, now I think I'm a butterfly. Or at least a moth with ambition. The crowd erupted in laughter, clapping and cheering for him, Martha, and Tommy. Riley gave him a thumbs up from the front row, still teasing but sincere. Luke watched a butterfly land on a marigold, perfectly still for a moment before flitting away into the golden sunlight. He smiled, reflecting on the journey, the clumsy steps, the mud, the spilled soil, the public spectacle, all the moments that had seemed like failures at the time. He realized that transformation wasn't a sudden event. It was an accumulation of persistence, humor, community, and self-belief. As dusk settled over Burlington, the golden light casting long shadows over the garden, Luke Henderson leaned on a planter and whispered to himself, sometimes to become a butterfly, you have to look ridiculous first. The town, with its pastel houses, flowering trees, and soft string-lit streets, felt alive and welcoming. Luke's laughter mingled with the chirping of birds and the gentle flutter of butterfly wings, a symphony of transformation, absurdity, and hope. By nightfall, the garden glowed softly under fairy lights, the community dispersed, and Luke sat on his porch, reflecting on the metaphorical and literal journey. He had started as a caterpillar, messy and uncertain, and emerged with a newfound sense of confidence, humor, and connection. The butterflies, now numerous, flitted past like living punctuation to his story. Luke sipped his tea and smiled, knowing that growth was messy, public, hilarious, and ultimately beautiful. A lesson worth every mud-streaked shirt, sideways flower, and laugh-filled misstep.
Like and subscribe if you want to be happy and motivate.